Hey everybody, how are you doing? I hope you're well and your studies are going smoothly. It's time to revise and I'm going to support you to do that. Today we're going to be looking at AQA Psych Paper 1. It's going to be memory, explanations for forgetting, interference theory. So let's do it. First job. This is an interactive session, so press pause, blurt what you can about interference theory, so knowledge, evaluation, studies, whatever you got, and then come back and we'll compare. Here's your chance to do that. And here we go. So this could look different to yours, but generally you're probably going to be recalling, or you should be recalling, that it's where information is forgotten because similar information is disrupting or blocking other information. And you've got two types. You've got proactive and retroactive interference. You might remember some studies such as the ones I've listed there. And in terms of evaluation, you're hopefully remembering that you can use some research to support the theory. Maybe you're going to discuss the fact that a lot of the evidence for this is artificial. You could discuss how it only occurs with similar information, and maybe it's only a temporary effect, maybe concluding that it's a partial explanation for forgetting. So there's lots of points there. Let me know how you got on with that. And now we're going to try some questions to apply this. So, okay, it's interactive again, so pause the video at this point and you can pick some to practice. You've got the marks and the times up there as well. You don't have to do all of them. It's your revision. And then simply just press play again when you're ready for me to talk through. All right, there's your chance. So, using an example, explain the term interference. So let's select the knowledge that's relevant for dealing with this question. Okay. I would probably say something along the lines of interference is an explanation for forgetting, or it's where we forget information because it's being disrupted by similar information. It does say give an example, so make something up. For example, when learning French and Spanish, this could lead to interference because many of the words are very similar. Okay, so 1 mark for an explanation, 1 mark for an example, I would imagine. Okay, distinguish between retroactive and proactive interference. The command word here is distinguish, so that means that we need to explain the difference between them. We're not going to bother just with definitions or similarities, it's the difference. And I'm probably going to use some comparative language in the middle. So proactive is where old information disrupts new information, whereas retroactive is where new information disrupts the recall of older information. There you go, 2 marks. Outline 1 study in which researchers tested the effects of interference. Now, there are no key studies on the spec for interference, but you'll be expected, as with pretty much every other topic, to be aware of studies in the area. So you can pick, but for this, it makes sense, I think, to sort of break it up into the procedure and the findings. So I've gone with the McGeoch and MacDonald study. So they used different word lists. They had an original sort of list that they had to learn at a sort of, I'm going to call that maybe a base list, or I suppose an original list would do. And then they learned a different list, and that could have been a list of synonyms, so words that mean the same, a list of antonyms, so they mean the opposite, but they're obviously still connected. Just a list of other words, or numbers, or meaningless words, just some other different lists, okay, that varied in how similar they were to the original list. Then they are testing recall of the original list, doing some comparisons, and they found that the new lists that were more similar to the original list, so the synonyms, disrupted recall of the original list. And actually, the more similar, the worse the effect. So synonyms was the worst, then antonyms, which, although it means the opposite, they're still related, that disrupted as well, all the way down to just numbers, for example, which didn't have much of an impact. So what does that demonstrate? It demonstrates the idea of similarity, and they found support for the idea of retroactive interference. Okay, you could use a different study, but that's what that response could look like. Right, application question. Using our knowledge of interference, we need to explain Leo's difficulty here. So he was reading the Harry Potter books. He's read the second one, despite not finishing the first one, which sounds silly to me, but he was just too excited, so he couldn't contain himself. He had to read the second one, and he's then found it tricky to remember what was going on in the first book. Okay, let's recall our knowledge first. So we know that interference happens with similar information. We know that there's retro and proactive. What's most relevant here? The idea of similarity. So linked to the stem, the characters, the events of the Harry Potter books are going to be similar, if not the same, which makes interference more likely. I don't need any specialist knowledge of the Harry Potter series in order to answer this question. Just the idea that 2 books are from the same series is enough here to be hopefully inferring that there's going to be similar settings and characters. It is retroactive interference here because Leo has read the 2nd book most recently and is trying to remember the 1st book, so that interference is going back in time. Alright, hopefully you got on okay with that. 8 marker next, and you know that the breakdown here is going to be 3 marks for your knowledge, your AO1, and 5 marks for that discussion, evaluation, commentary. So, let's recall some knowledge again here and talk about possible ways of answering this. So, you could latch onto the idea that it's research, as in studies. So, potentially what I would do here is outline a study. So, that study we talked about earlier with the different word lists, that could form my knowledge, bit of procedure and findings there. And then for 5 marks, I'd probably be doing 2 sort of peels or discussion points. Maybe one about how it's good that it was controlled, talking about how, you've got these lists, they've all got the same lists, they've got the same conditions, it's a lab-style study, talking about all the benefits of that. Countering that with the idea that maybe it's artificial, maybe on balance despite high internal validity. Research into interference like this study maybe has lower external validity. Maybe a bit of a discussion like that. And then if I felt like I needed it, I could bring in another little discussion point about how there's lots of other studies that have supported it, therefore showing the study's reliable. Maybe, if you're aware of it, the Baddeley and Hitch rugby study, or another example. Okay, so that's one way of dealing with it, but mark schemes do include phrases like research can refer to study and or theory, or studies and or theories. So you could use your 3 marks of knowledge to actually outline the theory and then discuss the theory. I'm just always sort of pulled towards talking about studies when it says research, but I think that's just a me thing. All right. On to the 16 marker then. And here the focus is on discussing interference itself as an explanation. So the focus is the theory. Again, let's just recall the relevant knowledge here. We've been through all of this, so I'm not going to read it all out, but your 6 marks of AO1 are for your outline of the theory, the different processes involved, getting across that issue of similarity. You could use studies if you felt like you needed to say a bit more for the AO1. You could use studies to illustrate it. Potentially what I would do though is use those studies as your evaluation, or part of your evaluation anyway, because you could do a discussion paragraph about how there's research support. However, countering that with the issue of artificial evidence, a bit like I talked about in the previous question review. Maybe I could then have another discussion point about how it is maybe only a partial explanation for forgetting because it only occurs with similar information, or it's only a temporary effect. I could even, if I wanted to, and some of you might have thought about this, have a discussion paragraph maybe comparing it with something like retrieval failure. Yeah? Really just trying to show that interference isn't the only way of explaining forgetting. Yeah, there are other factors involved. Yeah, maybe you could talk about how interference seems to be an explanation for long-term forgetting, and maybe there are different factors involved with short-term memory. Okay, there you go, just some thoughts, but you got your 6 knowledge marks, you got 10 evaluation marks. I'm probably looking at 3 discussion paragraphs in that 10 marks. Okay, so it's really important when you're doing this sort of thing that you take a sec just to review how that's gone. So we've been retrieving and practicing today, and you reflect on potential areas that you need to sort of feed back into your future revision and action plan. If you're looking for some extra resources to help you with any of your revision, I've got the Psychology Wordsearches book if you're looking for something a bit more light-hearted and maybe not so geared up towards exam prep. Or I've got the Research Methods Practice Questions and Answers book available on Amazon now, really if you're at the point where you just need to sit and practice some exam-style questions. So we've been discussing interference theory and looking at some exam questions there. I hope you got on well with it. Even if you didn't give it a go, I hope it was helpful. Have a lovely day. Do please drop me a comment if you've got any questions or, comments. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to support the channel. Thanks very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in another video.